Iraj Abedian, founder and chief executive of Pan-African Investment and Research Services. Iraj, thank you so much for joining us. So let's start actually with what Manqoba was telling us, because he was talking about the e-tolls issue. It's been a thorn in the side of Gauteng drivers since 2013. Do you think we're actually going to get an announcement tomorrow from the finance minister? And what do you reckon he's going to say?
I think, Sally, if eventually the minister is going to say anything, it would be only one thing. It's to scrap it formally, because the nation, the citizens, the drivers have already scrapped it and disregarded without any consequence. So I think that's, as you mentioned a few seconds ago, is dead in the water. So I'd rather acknowledge and move on.
The truth is it's going to be difficult to move on. The reality is someone's going to pay. So if it's not the user, clearly it's not the user, it's going to have to be taxpayers in general. And then there's that issue of what about the loyal people who have been paying their e-tolls all along? Could they not be in line?
That's right, and I've been one of them. I've been, Sally, one of the law-abiding citizens that I thought, okay, I'll obey, hoping that the government will stick to its term. I'm sure if they scrap it, there will be some legal cases against the ministry as well. But it's part of poor governance. Broadly, this is a very good example of how not to govern, how not to drag simple issues until the citizens become frustrated, disillusioned, and, in the language of economists, undermine tax morality.
So there's so much for him to actually address tomorrow. We know it's a medium-term budget, so it's mostly just tweaks. But there has been quite a significant shift in global politics with the war in Ukraine affecting everyone's economy and a lot of pressures at home as well. Let's start with the public sector wage bills. That issue is getting closer and closer to a strike. It looks like 3% offer was made, possibly off the table now, unions wanting 10%. Do you think it's important that the finance minister stick to his guns on not giving a big increase? Do you believe he actually can do that, bearing in mind we've seen Transnet workers get a 6% increase, Eskom workers get a 7% increase?
And inflation is running on average above 7%, close to 7.5%. And for much of the lower income paid working class, the actual inflation is double digit. So there is a reality there that the government cannot ignore. At the same time, there is another reality from a political point of view, from purely budget or politics of budget. You cannot have ministers, top pay echelon of the public sector, having these massive pays, massive perks. And let me just give you one example. Every minister costs us much more than any top executive in the country because of their drivers, bodyguards, free this, free that, free flights, and so it goes. So I think there is a fundamental what we call it in the language of economics is allocative efficiency issue that government does not want to deal with it. And that is, you cannot hold the lower paid staff, especially the service providing segment of the public service, and keep paying the ministers and the deputy ministers and DGs and so on. So I think we need to sort that one out. With this minister will do it, I doubt it, because that is not something that the minister can do it. The cabinet must make the decision. That leadership should come from the president, and I just don't see it in the circumstances that the president faces.
Yeah, and essentially you lose your moral authority if you don't lead by example when you're explaining, and Basatu explained this as well last night. The cabinet is not doing that. Of course, the other big topic that is going to have to be addressed is Eskom. We're currently sitting in stage 4 load shedding. I suppose there's not much the finance minister can do about that. But the issue of Eskom's debt, do you think he's going to use the commodities windfall to offset some of Eskom's debt? And do you think that would be a good idea?
I think commodities windfall to begin with is cooling off. The global economy is cooling off, as mentioned, because of the war, because of all sorts of other tensions and logistical disruptions. So I think the commodity prices have come down. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the poor state of our rail and our ports, as we've seen it in the near collapse of Transnet, and the inefficiencies has made it not easy for the commodities export and earn income. So I think we cannot, as we did last year, rely on tax revenues from commodities to flow in no matter what. Having said that, yes, that still provides revenue, but against that, government has got many other demand on its revenue. A very important factor that you did not mention, and it's very important, is the fact that internationally and locally interest rates are rising, have risen, and are continue to rise for at least another 12 months. And that means the cost of existing debt for government is rising. I would not be surprised if if tomorrow's projections public debt shows again almost reaching the 80% and higher than the GDP, because the GDP is not performing, the public debt is rising, and the servicing of the public debt as it is also rising. So against that, what can the government do for ESCOM? As you know, 3 ministers of finance have promised 3 solutions, and they haven't stuck to any of them. This minister has earlier on in the year hinted that maybe the National Treasury should borrow and fill that hole, the 400 billion hole that ESCOM has. I suspect and I expect that tomorrow there will be a confirmation around that. Whether it will be all of it, half of it, or a quarter of it, I don't know, but it will be at least a quarter, potentially half of it, which is 200 billion rand. And that would immediately spike the public debt at the time that the cost of debt is rising. Then you have the NEL. Then you have Transnet. And so it goes. So I think the minister is facing a huge problem here. Revenue is stagnating, and demand on expenses or on revenue is rising rapidly, and the economy is stagnating.
Yeah, so I know I have to let you go. One last very quick question. If there's one thing you most want to hear that will give you cheer tomorrow, what is it?
I would say rebalance government expenditure away from the ministerial handbook and more towards nurses, teachers, and policemen, and focus on not just numbers, look at the merit, look at the quality of public service, and not just the numbers or the size of it. Unless we deal with that, we're going to every year for the next 10 years have the same discussion, and the economy will go lower and lower, and the public service will become, by way of productivity and quality of services, declining.
Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Always a pleasure. Iraj Abedian, founder and chief executive of Pan-African Investment and Research.